Well, hello, my name's Louise Savage. A very warm welcome to my channel and a welcome back if you're a returning visitor. I am at the peak of excitement today because I've just packed my bags and tomorrow I'm heading down to London for the glorious Women's Prize Award ceremony. As many of you know, the Women's Prize means an awful lot to me. I think it's worked miracles in terms of getting women's stories heard, and we have the fantastic news that there's going to be a Women's Prize for non-fiction next year as well. It just couldn't be better, which seems to me to be going some way towards redressing the balance between the male and female perspective on life, the universe and everything, which for many millennia has been, you know, largely told, unfortunately, from the male point of view. That's not to denigrate men. It just seems a shame that when we live in a world that is roughly 50-50, we don't necessarily hear women's stories. So to celebrate the prize this year, what I thought I'd do is make a video where I don't really talk about the shortlist at all. Well, I do a bit, but where I look at the shortlisted books and then recommend a couple of books that if you liked that book, you may, you know, I feel you might enjoy subsequently, something to sort of turn to. And actually, it's not my own idea. It's a real shame because I can't remember who now. It's quite a while ago, but somebody commented and suggested it as an idea. And I just thought, oh, I love the idea of that. So thank you very much to whoever that was. And I'm really sorry I can't acknowledge it. It's got lost in the ether. That is my memory. Okay, so first up then, I've done this in alphabetical order. We had Firerush by Jacqueline Crooks. Wonderful novel. And I suppose what I've tried to do is to sort of think, for me as a reader, what was the essence of this novel, and therefore if somebody really enjoyed this book, what might they take, you know, what might they then subsequently go on to read. So so the first book that I chose, having read this as a kind of, you know, follow on or something to follow up, was actually another book that was long listed, I think, possibly no, I think it was shortlisted for the Women's Prize, and that's Ordinary People by Diane Evans. Now, the reason I picked this was partly because, for me, Firerush, one of the wonderful things about it is the fabulous 70s soundtrack. And there's a similar thing going on in this novel. So we've got a really good, you know, all the way through, there's this kind of musical soundtrack. And again, I think, like with Firerush, I could be wrong, but I think you can kind of download a soundtrack to this. And this novel is really about two couples, but it focuses mostly on Melissa and Nathan, I want to say. I can't remember her husband's name. But it's two couples who are sort of kind of coming to terms with early middle age. They've got children. Melissa is really battling with the sort of tension of her work, herself as a, you know, as a woman in her own right, who goes out to work, and although is currently working from home, she writes for a fashion magazine, but also her role as a parent, and her husband, who's absolutely sort of appears to be, you know, really into her, is sort of constantly kind of frustrated by the lack of attention, her distraction, I suppose, because of all the other things that she's trying to do, and that sort of creates a tension within the marriage. So we spend quite a lot of time with them and in their household. And then they've got a couple who they're very close friends with, who live, so they live in central London, and they've got a couple who live a little bit further out, more towards sort of suburbia, and their situation is slightly different in that the female of the couple seems to be relatively contented with her sort of role as a parent, but her husband is struggling, and he develops a bit of a thing for Melissa. So there's quite a lot of sort of tension, friction, like there is in Firerush, but it's mainly the kind of musical the soundtrack and the way it kind of really captures an era and helps to enhance your experience of reading the novel that I feel is the connection between these two books. The second book that I think would go, might be somewhere to go to if you enjoyed Firerush, is actually The Trouble with Goats and Sheep by Joanna Canon. Now, unfortunately, I don't have a copy to show you because I've lent it to someone and I haven't had it back. So whoever you are, I would love that book back. But the reason that I think you might enjoy that is because one of the things I loved about Firerush as well was the 1970s vibe, the way it really, really recaptures that. So for me, as somebody who was a young person in the 1970s, there was a lot of nostalgia in reading it. If you are younger than me, which is highly likely, then, you might be quite curious about what the 70s felt like. And I think Firerush really captured that nicely. And I think Joanna Canon's novel does that too. Because the novel is set in 1976 when there was a real drought. So you've got that kind of heat and that crackle behind the novel. And the setting's fantastic. It's kind of set down this suburban street, which is still really vivid in my memory. Reminds me a little bit, if you enjoyed Spies by Michael Frayn, that kind of claustrophobic, hot summer, and we see things largely from the point of view of a young girl. I think she's 10, and Mrs. Creasy disappears down the road, and this young girl, she takes it upon herself to find out where she's gone and how she's vanished and so on. So you've got that kind of, there are quite a few sort of detective-ish elements to this story. But it's much more about, a young girl's perception of the world, what it was like to live through the 70s. And also I think it captures suburbia really well. There's a whole sort of host of characters and the different people who live in the different streets. So yeah, for me, those two seemed like natural kind of follow-ons from Firerush. Next up is Trespasses by Louise Kennedy. And of course, this is a novel set in Northern Ireland, and the young woman Kushla is really, really trying to make sense of the world that she's living in. She has her sort of first really serious relationship with a much older man. And the book that leapt into my head, and again, unfortunately, I haven't got my own copy of it here at home, but it's a novel that was actually written for young adults, but I think it's a superb book. And it's called Wolf by Gillian Cross. And it's, again, set in the same sort of period, but it's set in London because, of course, there was a lot of tension in Belfast, but equally in the 70s, there was a lot of tension in London as well. And in fact, I think, if I remember rightly, I think the Gillian Cross book is set a little bit later when these things are still, pertinent. So anyway, it's a book about a young girl called Cassie who lives with her father's mother, so her grandmother, but it's on the father's side. And she lives with her father's mother because her own mother seems to be quite dysfunctional, very lovely character, but really not quite stable enough, I suppose, for Cassie to spend too much time with. And her mother lives with her boyfriend, and he also has a son, and they have this kind of really quite alternative theatre company, and they're putting together a production all about wolves, hence the title. But actually the wolf of the title is somebody else. And what happens is Cassie wakes up in the night and she hears footsteps, and the following morning she is sent to live with her mother. And this is a pattern that has happened, during her childhood. And I don't think it's a spoiler to say we very quickly realise that these footsteps, it's the wolf, it's the father, and he is a very notorious terrorist from Northern Ireland. So, there's that whole sort of tension that, the thing that this novel does is shows how damaging it is to everybody, even in London, which is, a long way from Belfast. Did I say Dublin earlier? That's awful. I meant Belfast. Even though it's such a distance geographically, the things that are happening, that tension that's happening in Belfast is having repercussions in other parts of the country. And you know, I felt that was really fascinating as well, and would link nicely. And then the other book that I picked is a book called, which I do have with me, called Requiem by Berlie Doherty. Now, this is a novel that is set in Ireland, but in Dublin, so, you know, Southern Ireland, or Ireland. The connection here is the relationships. So this is about a woman who grows up in Ireland and in a rural place, and there's a really sort of heavy Catholic tradition, and that has a huge impact on her development as a person, to the point where she ends up leaving and going to Venice. So you've got this other fantastic space in the novel. But the big connection is the fact that when she's in Venice, she meets and falls in love with a much older man. And one of the things that intrigued me and fascinated me about Trespasses was the way that relationship between Kushla and the older man was portrayed. And I think this novel does something similar in that regard. So I think possibly if you liked Trespasses, you might like, particularly for the relationships, you might enjoy Requiem by Berlie Doherty. Then we have the hefty Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver. And, you know, it didn't take me more than a minute to kind of make a leap from this book to another one. And the book I chose first of all as a connector, and many of you may have read this, and you can't even see the title on the cover because this is a really old, lovely cloth-bound copy, but it's The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck. And one of the things that I loved about Demon Copperhead was its social conscience. I think there's a really strong social conscience to this novel, the way it's exposing the exploitation, the very callous and what's the word, just really visible exploitation of the Appalachian community through the farmer companies. And I think, you know, this novel, which was written in the 1930s by John Steinbeck, The Grapes of Wrath, it is one of my favourite novels. I make no apologies for that. It tells the story of the Joads, who are a sort of rural farming family, very down on their uppers. It's the 1930s, it's the Dust Bowl. The novel opens with Tom Joad coming out of the penitentiary. He's been banged up for, I can't remember, 4 or 5 years, but he should have served a much longer sentence for homicide, which he hasn't committed. And he comes out and meets somebody who gives him a lift. And as a result, as a consequence, his family end up uprooting and making that journey, which many hundreds, if not thousands, of Americans made from Oklahoma across to California. And this novel, it has the scope that Demon Copperhead has. It has one of the things I liked about Demon Copperhead was that there are lots of characters that kind of come in and out of the novel as Demon grows older. And I think because this is a kind of almost like a novelistic version of a road movie, you've got, you know, various new characters who come in and come out, and then people that they hook up with again further down the journey. And yeah, I just think it's gritty and it's sincere. And I think there's something that Barbara Kingsolver's prose is really spare. It's and I think Steinbeck's similar, that there's an elaborateness to it, but equally a real simplicity, and it's really hard to describe and explain that. But I think when I was reading Demon Copperhead, I had echoes of Steinbeck in my head stylistically as well, partly the dialogue too, I think, because Steinbeck often, I think reading Steinbeck sometimes is more like reading a play script in many ways. So yeah, there we go. I think if you haven't read Grapes of Wrath and you loved Demon Copperhead, give it a whirl. The other novel that I picked up was English Passengers. Again, this is one of my favourite books of all time, by Matthew Kneale. I only found out recently that he's the son of Judith Kerr, who did those wonderful children's books about the cat and so on. And I think The Tiger Who Came for Tea was her as well. If any of you are familiar with that wonderful story, read many, many times to my children. English Passengers is full of humour. And again, you know, there were moments in Demon Copperhead I just loved. Sometimes it did make me laugh out loud, the perspective, because of his point of view, I suppose. Now, this is narrated by lots of different characters, to be fair. But there's something about it. Again, I don't know whether it's because it's a journey or because it's a novel that tackles colonialism. Really effectively. It just makes the whole thing look so stupid. You know, what is the point of trying to you know, colonize a place, but actually in the process you're destroying it and destroying its people? It just makes the whole enterprise look very illogical, but also celebrates adventure. So anyway, it's a story of the captain of the ship. So it's about a boat. No kidding. And what's he called? Ilium Quilliam. Oh, what's his name? It's just I thought I'd never forget it. It's the most fantastic name. Captain Ilium Quilliam, something beginning with K. I can't remember. But I think it's one of the most superb names in literature, even though I can't flipping remember it. But he's a captain of a ship. He comes from the Isle of Man, as do most of his crew. So there are Manx, we call them Manxers. They're a Manx crew, nothing to do with coming from Manchester. And all he's really interested in is doing a bit of smuggling and selling a bit of dodgy pornography. But he somehow ends up, a reverend persuades him to set sail to Tasmania, because this reverend has got hooked up with this theory that the Garden of Eden was in Tasmania. And so it's set in the 1850s, so they pursue this idea of trying to find the Garden of Eden, which of course is deeply ironic. And when they get to Tasmania, they meet, well, this other amazing character, Peavey, enters the novel, and he is, his mother is Aboriginal, his father was a white man who raped her, and she is campaigning against the whites in Tasmania. So again, you've got this kind of political conscience. Actually, in my mind, there are real connections between Peavey and Demon Copperhead. So again, the character, I mean. So again, you know, I would urge you, I thought this book was an absolute romp, but a romp that at the core of it had a really important message and was really trying to kind of expose, as I say, the idiocy of empire. Okay, and then next up we have Black Butterflies by Priscilla Morris. So this story is set in Sarajevo. It covers the siege of the city during the early 90s, and for me, one of the best accompaniments to this, if you really enjoyed this, is the amazing Jeremy Bowen's war stories. So actually I'm recommending some non-fiction here. So Jeremy Bowen is a BBC war correspondent, very, very brave man, some might say incredibly reckless. And there isn't a sort of conflict in the Middle East or, you know, Europe that he sort of hasn't covered since he took on that role. So there's a whole section in here about him walking into Mostar in the former Yugoslavia. There are episodes where he talks about Istanbul, you name it, it's in here, the Lebanon, whatever. And I love this book because I think it's a brutally honest account of what it's like to be a war correspondent, but also he really educates you about, you know, the situation as he found it at the time. I know that his latest book, which is, what's the title? It's something to do with explaining the Middle East. was the best-selling book at Hay Festival last week. And absolutely no surprises there. I think the man is exceptional. Every time I hear him on the radio or see him on the telly, I stop what I'm doing because I want to know what he's got to say. So I think if you want to kind of understand the backdrop of the siege, then I think of Black Butterflies, then I think you would really enjoy this. And I also think that whole sort of sense of claustrophobia and danger and tension emerges in the way that he describes his true, encounters with these events. And then the second book, I just gave it away really, I think, because I inadvertently mentioned the title, is Helen Dunmore's The Siege. I love Helen Dunmore's writing. I think she was a phenomenal novelist, and again, Women's Prize winner. But this novel, I think it was one of the first of hers that I read, and I probably chose it because I do like historical fiction, and this is set in Leningrad in 1940, I want to say 1942, and Leningrad is encircled by Nazi tanks, and it focuses on a young woman who is living with her little brother and her father, who's a blacklisted author. So that's really interesting, and they are experiencing the siege. And when I read Black Butterflies, I had a similar feeling to when I read The Siege. That whole sort of, boiling shoe leather to get some sort of nutrition, that whole sort of desperation and the lengths that people have to go to when they're living in that kind of circumstance, and also the suddenness of it and the horror of it. And in this novel in particular, it starts in September, so they're about to face a really severe Russian winter, which they've got to endure, and all of that makes it a very challenging but a very interesting read. And at the heart of this is romance. There's a young painter who comes into the young girl's life, and also the father rekindles a connection from his past as well. So it's a beautiful, beautiful piece of writing. And then we had The Marriage Portrait by Maggie O'Farrell, which was the stimulus for this book was a poem by Robert Browning called My Last Duchess, and a poem that I absolutely love. Even though I've had to teach it, I don't know how many times, I still really love bringing it to the attention of young people and discussing it and so on. And I love their reaction to the Duke when they realise, when they kind of get the measure of him, which they usually do quite quickly. But anyway, so this novel, again, for me, it was a no-brainer what I would recommend, and that is The Birth of Venus by Sarah Dunnant. So this story is about a young woman. A lot of these stories seem to be, don't they? And she is living in Florence in the 1500s. And the reason that I think if you liked The Marriage Portrait you would like this is partly because this is about art, and so she's growing up, her father's a merchant, so they're relatively well to do, and of course, how do you show off your wealth? You have a painter come and paint stuff on your walls. So this painter arrives to paint frescoes, and of course she takes a liking to him. And it's not quite what the family want. Her mother is absolutely intent on making her marriageable and attractive, and that's all she's fit for. And her brother has found an alternative marriage, somebody who's marriage material. So you can see there's friction there. But the thing that really, this was the first Sarah Dunnant book I bought, and I think I got it from a charity shop. And I just read the blurb and thought, well, this is good. There's something that happens in the first couple of pages. It starts off with a nun. And there's something that happens in the first couple of pages that I will never, ever forget. It just gave me such a, whoa, I didn't see that coming moment. It's a wonderful piece of writing, and if you love reading about the 16th century, and if you love reading about Italy, and again that's another connection of course with Ferrara in The Marriage Portrait. The next book I chose to link with the marriage portrait was this one by Geraldine Brooks. Geraldine Brooks, again, is one of my favourite writers. I think she writes the most beautiful prose. Again, really simplistic writing style, but not a word wasted. And this is called The Secret Chord. And the reason that it chimed with me is that it's an exploration of a really powerful man, or a man who becomes incredibly powerful against the odds. So, you know, the presentation of the Duke in here and his dominance and his power and his hold. This is the story of the biblical King David, and his kind of, it traces his what is he? He's kind of like he's not a scribe. One of his advisors, I think, writes an account of David's life. So it's towards the end of his life, and he's reflecting and looking back and writing this account of it. So the stimulus, of course, is all those Bible stories about David, and he's a fascinating character in this novel, because there are many, many things to celebrate about him. He's brave, he's daring, he's the most fantastic musician. He plays the harp, and apparently Geraldine Brooks was stimulated to write this by because her son started having harp lessons, and that was kind of the stimulus, which I thought, I didn't know that. I found that out recently. So anyway, yeah, he's got all this amazing potential, but equally there's something very barbaric and hideous about him as well. So he rapes someone, for example, and the way that he deals with that and the consequences of that is absolutely appalling. So you've got a really interesting portrait of a man of power, and a man who gains power against the odds, and how that impacts his relationships. But you do also get other perspectives in here as well. So he's got 3 or 4 different wives, and you know, they convey their version. You get the version of Solomon, who's his younger son, who's born, you know, quite late in David's life. So yeah, I think this is another novel that just shows how literature builds on art, builds on literature from the past. There's no such thing as a new story, is there really? But it's all about interpretation and perspective. So yeah, I really love this book. And finally, last but not least, I chose a couple of novels that I thought, if you enjoyed Pod, what might you enjoy? Now, I found this novel problematic. It's quite violent and lots of sex in it and what have you, but it's really clung on to me. It's really stayed with me in a way that I didn't expect it would. I am still swimming through all that murky, polluted, horrible water. So I think as a kind of powerful political message, it really does its job very well. But what I chose a novel called From the Wreck by Jane Rawson. This is a proof copy, which is why it's so big. It's bigger than my face. And this is a really unusual novel. It's really hard to pigeonhole. It's been described as sci-fi, it's been described as historical fiction, but essentially it's about a man who is shipwrecked, and for a week after the boat is destroyed, he's kind of clinging on for his life, and out of the water emerges this female who he spends time with, gets close to in that week when he's hanging on for his life, literally. You know, I mean, he narrowly escapes death. Eventually, he's rescued by a lifeboat, and the minute that happens, she disappears. And there's quite a supernatural thread through this story. But again, I have not forgotten those descriptions of the water. They've really stayed with me in the way that the water did in Pod. And there are all sorts of really interesting messages in this novel as well, because it tells the story of what happens to him beyond that experience and how it affects his family as well. And what was that female? You know, she does reappear. So very spooky, very weird in the way that I found Pod weird, but I loved this book. And finally, Daisy Johnson's Everything Under. I think, again, if you liked Pod, you might like this this novel. So it tells the story of a woman who is, I think she's working as a doctor. Is she working as a doctor? I think she is, in a hospital, and she gets a phone call. Or does she get a phone call from a hospital? Oh, that's terrible. My memory, honestly. Been doing quite well up till now. Anyway, it tells the story of a woman who didn't know her father, who grew up with her mother on a canal, and she gets a phone call, and basically all these memories of her childhood on the in the canal boat. They're actually on a river, so is it a canal boat or is it a river boat? Well, whatever. But all her memories of her childhood start to kind of come back, and this phone call compels her to return to the river. And when she was growing up, she kind of had her own invented language. Oh no, that's right, of course, she's not a doctor, she's a lexicologist. She works with words, and I think that's meant to be a sort of stimulus from when she was younger and had this invented language with her granny. So she grew up on this barge with her granny, and she goes back, returns to this place, and she remembers this boy as well who came to live with them for a while. There's all this kind of mystery around her youth. And the relationships, the adult relationships, the absences really within it. But in this novel, the river is a character in its own right, I feel. And again, it's kind of the water and the kind of strangeness of the setting that I think would really if you enjoyed Pod, I think you might enjoy this novel as well. So there we go. They are my recommendations. And yeah, I look forward to seeing your comments and whether you've read any of these, whether you're intending to read any of them. Please keep the comments coming, because it's a joy. It really is. I know sometimes I don't have time to say very much back, but I do try to reply to everybody in some way or another. And yeah, I just love it, seeing what your responses are. So thank you for watching. Thank you for joining me on this lovely sunny afternoon. And yeah, next time I see you all, we'll be on the run up to the Women's Prize, because Simon of Savage Reads fame, are going to record our individual winners, and we're going to rank order the shortlist, which is going to be really difficult. I still have not made my mind up. I think we might be doing it tomorrow, so it's going to be a lot of books to take on the train. I hope you realise that, folks, the sacrifices we make. Especially Demon Copperhead, it's huge. I've had to make a lot of space in my suitcase. Thank goodness it's warm weather and I haven't got to take lots of layers, just take lots of books instead. Anyway, take care, everybody. It's been a pleasure. Bye.